Uh, Thanks for being here bright and early to hear from our dissemination implementation science experts. We'll be starting with Dr. Brian Mittman for our keynote. Dr. Mittman is a senior research scientist at Kaiser Permanente Southern California's Department of Research and Evaluation, as well as a senior scientist at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Center for Healthcare Innovation, Implementation, and Policy in Los Angeles. He convened the planning committee that launched the journal Implementation Science, the premier journal in our field, and served as co-editor-in-chief from 2005 to 2012. He was a founding member of the U.S. Institute of Medicine Forum on the Science of Quality Improvement and Implementation, and chaired the NIH Special Emphasis Panel on Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health in 2007 and 2010. He currently serves on the methodology committee for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. Who here has heard of PCORI? All right, about half of you. Great. It's a fantastic national funder. They're supported through funds via the ACA on a tax on health insurance companies. And the Association of American Medical Colleges Advisory Panel on Research, as well as advisory boards for several additional U.S. and international research programs in implementation science. And so, Dr. Mittman, please come share with us. You'll be speaking about the intersection of quality improvement, learning health systems, and system-level change in the context of pragmatic research.
Thank you. I'll have a chance to return the favor and I introduce our implementation science stars over the next hour or so. So my thanks to Lacey and the planning committee for the invitation, the opportunity. When Lacey first contacted me, my immediate response says, anytime there's an audience willing to hear me talk about implementation, some of these other buzzwords, I'm there. Besides, who do you know from Southern California who wouldn't respond positively to an invitation for all expenses paid trip to Chicago in February? The white text or the assigned buzzwords, that didn't seem to be enough, so I added at least one, and there are actually a couple of others that you will hear over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, including some brief discussion of complex health interventions. So the bingo game is to check the boxes for each of these as you hear me talk about. I don't have any disclosures in terms of traditional COI disclosures, so if I hold it over my head, it works. But I will disclose that I'm about to violate just about every best practice recommendation for presentations, namely 3 of them. Too many slides, too many words on the slides, and I'm going to talk too fast. What I'd like to do is give you a very high-level overview of a lot of the key concepts and principles that we use in these various fields. Our 3 experts will do a deep dive and cover them to a much greater extent. So let me start with this 17-year phrase, which to those of us in the field is still a little bit questionable as far as the evidence base, but it makes an important point, so we like to use it. What I'd like to do is walk you through a few key slides, diagrams very quickly that basically define and describe the scope of implementation science. What is it? Why is it important? How does it relate to other categories of health-related research? This is a diagram that I'm sure you've all seen before, the basic translational pipeline, where in an ideal world, we would see rapid progress through these phases. Positive, useful output from basic science would quickly be picked up by the clinical research community that would in turn develop effective interventions, prevention, treatment, management, so on. And they would immediately be adopted, taken up, and lead to improved health outcomes. Of course, it takes 17 years and so on. There are many translational roadblocks. Much of this literature is published and sits on the shelf for a number of years before its value is recognized and it's picked up and moved through the next phases. Some of the output, though, should actually sit on the shelf because it doesn't offer any value. So it's not that everything that emerges from basic science should be picked up by the clinical research community, and same for the output of clinical research. But by and large, too much of this output is not moved rapidly along the pipeline to produce improvements in health. We label the first set of translational blocks or translational activities type 1, the second type 2. Many of us in the field have spent a great deal of time trying to eliminate use of the T word to describe implementation science because it just causes confusion. So we tend not to use type 2 translation or translational research, but instead talk about implementation research or implementation science. An important point, the 17 years actually applies only to the second half of this pipeline. When we think about the entire process, we're talking about decades. So these are publications that I hope you all recognize, some of the original work that led to recognition and work to reduce the translational roadblocks. There's yet another reason, though, for interest in implementation. In the need for implementation, we oftentimes talk about the fact that we are at the sharp end of the spear, the tip of the spear, the very end of that pipeline. And those who are working to try to ensure that all of the valuable evidence-based practices, innovations actually benefit health. Russ Glasgow likes to present this slide that basically goes through a series of calculations showing the relatively small proportion even when we do have good, solid evidence that actually benefits patients. So this is another way of thinking about the motivation for implementation research, implementation science, and our need to do a better job in implementing. This is one of my favorite articles, and came out. It was known more for the Washington Post publication than the original peer-reviewed publication. But instead, the idea, though, was to try to compare the net benefits to society of additional investments in drug development, yet another Me Too drug, versus the net benefits of investing in making good use of what we already have. As you can imagine, because I'm using this as in an implementation science talk, the latter is the better buy. So again, another motivation or argument in favor of more and better implementation research to guide and facilitate more and better implementation. A number of years ago now, Martin Eccles in the UK and I sat down with a group of colleagues to launch a new journal in the field that Bethany mentioned. This was the definition of the field that we had adopted or adapted from previous definitions. I want to highlight two parts of this definition. The first is what we typically think of as implementation research. It's the interventional activity. Our goal is to develop and evaluate and refine effective strategies for accelerating implementation. The second half of the definition, we sometimes label as the sort of the basic science that underlies implementation science, which in many ways is somewhat of an applied field. Healthcare delivery science, health system science, there are a number of terms that float around, all of which capture the second half. Our desire to understand how decisions are made and how healthcare is delivered. And armed with a better understanding of those processes, the influences, the factors, we can presumably do a better job of implementing and overcoming the barriers. This is sort of a 4-chapter story that provides yet another way of understanding the scope, the goal of implementation science. We, of course, begin with the publication of new evidence, new innovations, new findings. Typically, when they are produced or published, especially if it is a so-called definitive study, there will be accompanying editorials and some publicity attempting to inform the public and the profession about those findings. Many years later, the health services research community will often go back and document patterns of use and adoption. And more often than not, the rate of change in the adoption of these new findings is not very impressive. And that triggers us as implementation researchers to go back and try to understand the barriers and try to develop strategies to overcome those barriers. And again, yet another way of understanding and thinking about how implementation research relates to other categories of research. We as implementation scientists are just as interested as all of you in other fields of science in reducing mortality, reducing morbidity, improving quality of life. We enter the game early on in this causal pathway. The fields of basic science, physiology, epidemiology, produced the insights that told us that smoking causes lung cancer and lung cancer causes mortality. The clinical research community develops and evaluates interventions to reduce smoking behavior. we step into the game to try to increase the rate of utilization, adoption, delivery of those interventions. So again, another diagram showing how we fit into the world. We have our own version of the Tower of Babel problem, multiple labels, multiple terms. For those of us in the field, understanding all of these is mandatory. For those of you not in the field, it's also important to understand these, to recognize them when you see an article talks about technology transfer or talks about research utilization. That's part of our field. So let me now focus on this fourth chapter of the story, the development and evaluation of interventions to increase adoption. Pointed out first that when we talk about evidence-based practices or clinical research and its output, we're talking about a very heterogeneous group of innovations, interventions, and evidence, some of which are listed right here. We also know, though, that the likely stability of an estimate of effectiveness from any given study is somewhat limited. So in general, when I hear a knock on the door from a clinical research colleague talking about his or her latest finding and the desire to ensure that the whole world is aware of it, the first question is, what is the effect size estimate? What does the rest of the evidence look like? Is this ready for implementation? Or do we need more research before we're ready? Waiting until we have evidence syntheses and clinical practice guidelines is one way of assuring that the estimates are in fact stable and solid. The other point that this slide attempts to communicate is the fact that efficacy studies, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes again, are again not ready for prime time, not ready for implementation. The fact that something is effective in a sample of healthy white males in Cedars-Sinai in West Los Angeles, Beverly Hills, and other areas doesn't necessarily mean that it should be implemented widely. So ensuring that we understand the distinction between efficacy and effectiveness for pragmatic studies is critical for implementation researches. So we've been at this for quite a while. We haven't yet done the equivalent of curing cancer. There aren't a list of formulary approved, robustly effective implementation strategies so that we can walk into any health setting and help to facilitate rapid implementation. But we have learned a lot. And a lot of our learning is trial and error learning. And oftentimes it's more useful to understand what doesn't work than what does work. So understanding the barriers, the challenges is again, one of the foundational goals of our field. We know that there's a great deal of clinical inertia and conservatism, which oftentimes is appropriate. When we hear the lead author of a new article talking about how important it is to implement that finding widely, there's invariably a physician in the back of the room who raises his or her hand and points out that the study was conducted in a high SES setting in a sample of healthy white males, and it's not ready to be implemented. Or someone who will say, yes, your setting was different, it's not representative. So again, a great deal of oftentimes appropriate resistance and conservatism, and we need to understand that. We also have learned that barriers to practice change are numerous. They occur at multi-levels. They come from multiple stakeholders. And so the one version of this image is the way that I like to think about implementation. We are pushing a very heavy boulder up a steep hill. And not only is it heavy and steep, but we have a set of ropes and chains and bars that are holding that boulder in place. Too often, going back in the 1970s, but still today, our quality improvement or practice change strategies were the equivalent of eliminating one or two of those ropes and chains, but the rest remained in place. It's not enough for us to educate clinicians about a new practice or to encourage patients to be accepting. One of my next slides will go through a partial list of necessary but not sufficient conditions equivalent to the whole set of ropes and bars and chains that we need to think about. But the point is, these are complicated problems. They're very heterogeneous problems, and we need to recognize the numerous barriers. We also know, as I said, that the barriers are heterogeneous and vary. The fact that one site shows low adoption of a given practice, such as HPV vaccination rates, doesn't necessarily mean that another site with equivalent rates has the same root causes or underlying problems. In KP, Kaiser Permanente, Southern California, some of our low vaccination rate sites have low rates because the clinicians and nurses aren't following best practices. They aren't encouraging their patients to to accept the vaccine. In other settings, though, the physicians and nurses are doing everything they can. It's the anti-vax social norms and sentiments they're called. So we need to understand to diagnose those quality gaps, the implementation gaps, and develop tailored site-specific interventions. Because, as we like to say, beating on the heads of the clinicians to do better is not going to work if they're not the source of the problem. And the barriers change over time. The fact that there's a barrier 1 month doesn't mean that that same barrier will exist. So again, complicated problems. And obviously, as I've said, simple change efforts typically are equivalent to reducing or eliminating the single or 2 or 3 of the ropes and chains. So as I indicated a couple of minutes ago, this is a partial list of the conditions that need to be in place before we can expect to see practice change. It's not enough for us to publish the findings or to produce and disseminate a high quality clinical practice guideline. All of these other conditions need to be in place. Oftentimes, some of these other conditions are in place, so we don't necessarily need a bundle of implementation strategies addressing each of these barriers. We need to first understand which of these conditions is not present, what the barriers are, and then develop a tailored fit for purpose implementation bundle. But we know that without consumer acceptance, for example, HPV vaccination, we're not likely to see high rates of adoption. Physicians often respond not to what they see in the literature, instead what their colleagues do. Those of you who trained in the Eastside Hospital to learn that the practice is appropriate in steps will often then transfer over. The echoes, not just me. All right, let's hope that that's seems to be about the same. Where was I? We know that physicians often respond to professional norms, and you learn what to do based on what your colleagues do, your respected elders or mentors, not what the evidence says. So ensuring that the social norms are conducive is important as well. Oftentimes, physicians' health systems would like to do the right thing, but there are regulatory factors or fiscal barriers. Oftentimes, physicians are able to do the right thing, but they know that there are 20 right things they'd like to do. It's the squeaky wheel gets the grease sort of concept. When we have external incentives and attention performance measures, and when senior leaders of an organization focus on a given practice, that practice is likely to increase. But again, as with everything else, public reporting and external incentives are not enough. They're oftentimes necessary, but they're by no means sufficient. And then finally, the list of factors at the bottom. We need to ensure that clinicians are educated, that they have the knowledge, they have the skill. We need to show them that the evidence or quality gaps exist. Oftentimes, we've all had the experience of sitting in a CME session, learning about a new practice or a guideline and thinking to ourselves, clinicians, yes, I practice that way. In fact, oftentimes that's not the case. That what you feel are a small number of exceptions where you think the patient doesn't, is not focus of the guideline. In fact, the number of patients who are not getting guideline concordant care is much greater. I talked about item 8 previously, the need to diagnose, to identify the root causes. We can't solve the problem unless we know where it's coming from. And again, beating over them, the physicians on the head with education is not going to be enough in most cases. And finally, the issue of logistical arrangements. Kaiser likes to talk about the need to make the right thing the easy thing to do. We need group visits. We need computerized reminders, although not as many as we have right now. We need other organizational arrangements and systems in place that allow for the desired practice to be delivered. So you'll see this diagram in one of the subsequent talks, but basically it's a way of pointing out that the number of factors that influence clinical practices, the number of different levels where barriers might exist is considerable. And we need to be aware of each of these and again, go through the long checklist of potential barriers, potential influences, and ensure that the implementation bundle that we deploy focuses not just on the clinicians at the bedside, but also all of these other factors, all of these other players. So let me turn to a slightly different topic and talk a little bit about what we should implement and how, and talk about embedded research and the so-called engagement hypothesis, the hypothesis that clinicians are likely to accept evidence that they themselves had a hand in developing, whereas something that was developed elsewhere is not likely to be seen as legitimate. Pharmaceutical industry discovered this a number of years ago. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of seeding trials. The idea that you recruit physicians to participate in a drug trial, not because you need additional evidence, but because that launches the inertia. It allows them to become comfortable with that particular drug, and they're likely to continue using it. But we need to take seriously this concept of embedded research. I'm based at Kaiser Permanente in a research center where my salary is supported roughly 50% by the health system and 50% by external grants. The Department of Veterans Affairs does this very well. And increasing numbers of academic health systems and large commercial integrated delivery systems, Geisinger, Intermountain, and others, are launching embedded research programs. The idea that we should be conducting research within our own system with both of these goals. We have the continuum between pure basic science, which produces findings and knowledge about the way the world works, and eventually will lead to improvements in outcomes in the human condition, but only after many years. We have at the other end, quality improvement activity, which focuses on the here and now. Embedded research attempts to do both, to generate scientific knowledge at the same time that we produce near-term improvement. And that's at least one way of ensuring that the research that we conduct is recognized by, accepted by local clinicians and health system leaders, and that they're comfortable with that research. Another topic that will be covered, I believe, in Bethany's talk, and that is the list of stakeholders that need to be at the table. We like to believe that as researchers, we have something to offer, but in fact, it's somewhat limited, because what I can bring to the table, to the discussion, is knowledge of theory, knowledge of research methods, knowledge of prior research. But especially as a non-clinician, I have no expertise at all and no standing to talk about the barriers to clinical practice delivery, the barriers to acceptance. And that's what each of these other stakeholder groups do. And they need to be involved in our implementation strategy development, as well as the implementation bundle delivery or deployment. Here's another way of stating the same point, that when we develop the research and conduct it, develop the evidence-based practices and findings, and when we try to implement those, it's this team that's needed rather than just a small group of stakeholders. So let me go back to this slide and the question of what should we implement. So oftentimes we do, in fact, attempt to implement the results of effectiveness studies. There are occasionally very large pragmatic effectiveness studies, which we do feel are ready for implementation. Oftentimes they're at the end of a long stream of smaller studies, but the point is that the evidence base is sufficiently solid and stable that we should go ahead and proceed. The question is, what are the features of those pragmatic trials, those effectiveness studies that we need to take into account? Before I say a few words about that, let me walk you through very briefly this framework that helps me to understand the different categories of research. We're all accustomed to what I call Generation 1 research, clinical efficacy studies that support FDA decisions. They're typically conducted in a sample of healthy weight males. They typically give us an upper estimate of the likely efficacy, effectiveness of a given intervention. Generation 2 is what we've been engaged in more often than not in recent years. PCORI is focused primarily on this type of study, and it attempts to support not an FDA type decision, but instead a clinical practice decision. What do I need to understand about the likely effectiveness of this innovation for my patient in my real world setting? Generation 3 is the kind of research that we as implementation scientists conduct, as well as health promotion researchers and others who study complex health interventions. An implementation bundle is very different from a vaccine. The way that we design and conduct the study has to be very different as well, and we need to understand some of those differences. So when we think about Generation 2, the pragmatic studies, the best source of guidance is the PRACY2 tool or wheel. And the idea that we walk through each of these different dimensions and think about how real world realistic is the study that we are conducting. Are we providing incentives to patients to adhere to their medication prescriptions? Are we providing additional funding to the health systems to provide additional staff who, once the grant is over, are going to disappear and the entire thing's going to come crashing down? Are we generating Hawthorne effects where the fact that we as researchers are on site interviewing and collecting data and monitoring physician practices causes them to temporarily change their practices? But again, once we withdraw that artificial feature, things are likely to return to normal. So the point is that when we conduct research to evaluate clinical effectiveness of a clinical intervention, we need to recognize these features, these domains, and ensure that the study that we're conducting is producing evidence that's actually relevant. And pragmatic trials, effectiveness trials are the way to do that. So let me return to very briefly this concept of the different generations of research. As I said, generation one research, what we've done since the 50s, 60s, is all about supporting an FDA decision. FDA will approve a drug if it's effective for at least a subset of patients. So in cardiology, the study that pointed out that the inclusion-exclusion criteria for many studies in cardiology result in only 15% of all patients with a given indication being eligible for the study tells us that that drug is effective for that 15%. Tells us nothing about the other 85%. But as long as the harms for that other 85% are not significant, it's appropriate for us to conduct and publish this research in FDA to rely on. But it's not appropriate or useful at all for a physician at the front line. And in the evidence-based medicine era, where we try to practice evidence-based medicine, and we try to rely not just on our judgment and our experience and what we may have learned 20 years ago in medical school, we need a research that is much more pragmatic, much more relevant. And that's what this second generation is all about in the pragmatic studies that I just talked about. Let me introduce yet another item on the checklist in your bingo card, and that is complex health interventions. This is an entire other talk, so I'm not going to cover it in any detail, but simply introduce the concept. And again, that's the category of interventions like health promotion programs, quality improvement strategies, implementation bundles, others that have multiple components that are highly adaptable and tailorable. I like to say that adaptation happens in our world. Rather than ignore it or suppress it, which is what we're taught to do in graduate school to achieve fidelity, we should essentially be embracing that adaptation. We should recognize that oftentimes adaptation can help us to enhance effectiveness. So we should be trying to study it and ultimately trying to guide it. So when we think about this concept of generation 3 research in complex health interventions, to ask the simple question, is it effective, yes or no, is just not a useful question, because the answer is almost always it depends or sometimes. And we wouldn't want to encourage a health system leader to use a program that is effective only sometimes, that will be effective in only 1 or 2 sites within the health system, especially because it can be adapted or customized or tailored to meet the unique circumstances of the other sites. So when we think about conducting effectiveness studies on complex health interventions, such as health promotion programs, when we think about conducting effectiveness studies on implementation strategies, conducting implementation research, recognizing these unique features is critically important. I'll often say that our goal as researchers in implementation science is not to generate evidence, as we traditionally think about evidence with a capital E. An effect size estimate from an implementation study is the estimate of effectiveness in that set of sites at that time with the research team that happened to be involved. It has very low predictive value when we think about the likely effectiveness of that implementation bundle elsewhere. What we need as health system leaders is not evidence or a formulary approved list of implementation strategies. We need insights and we need guidance. So our function, our role, and our expected contributions as implementation researchers are not evidence in the traditional sense, but instead this concept of insights and guidance. We need to understand and study mechanisms of effect. We need to, as I said, embrace and study and guide adaptation. And again, a very different way of thinking about research. Let me go back 1 slide and very quickly, in about a minute, cover the last buzzword, and that is the concept of learning health systems. which is another topic that keeps me going. For the most part, we know that our implementation projects, and again, you'll hear more about this, tend to be focused on a given problem or implementation gap in a given set of sites. And those implementation studies are preceded by a set of studies to try to, as I've said a few times, identify and document the barriers. So this 17-year process includes several steps. If we attack quality gaps or implementation gaps on a problem by problem basis, think about the amount of time that would be needed. So we need to simultaneously think about not just bottom up, but top down solutions. Can we think about redesigning healthcare delivery organizations and systems in a way that will allow implementation to be somewhat more rapid, efficient, and automatic? We spent about 3 years trying to increase adherence to a recommendation that surgeons after bladder cancer surgery infuse the bladder with medication to eliminate any of the stray cancer cells. What if that clinical practice was guided not by the physicians, the surgeons, the pharmacists' own understanding, but instead by a written protocol, and they followed the cookbook? The implementation effort in that scenario involves a 5-minute word processing task to add the infused bladder with chemotherapy. That's not the way healthcare is delivered at this point, but thinking about that distinction between this top down and bottom up, I think is important for us to try to accelerate implementation. And the concept of learning healthcare systems, which again, I don't have time to discuss in detail, is the answer. And I'm eager to talk with anyone who's interested. So let me stop at that point. I may have used most of my question time, but as I said, encourage any of you who'd like to talk more about these, first of all, to hold until you hear the other 3 presentations, but at least some of us will be available for some informal discussion at the end of the conference. And I, for one, would be happy to talk.